Here we did a study into immigration, which was part of a deal with Senator Lindwall and the government to undertake a study. The final report hasn't been released yet, so what I am giving you today is a bit of caveated, so obviously it will come after the election, so I can talk to you about background and so on. We'll see how we go, and we can answer questions later. The three parts of the inquiry, which were pretty clear, was one about the costs and benefits of migration generally, one about whether we should have an entry charge, in other words, we should price or ration the quota for selling visas, if you like, which we, in our draft report, said we didn't think it was the right way to go. And then the interaction between temporary and permanent immigration. This gives you a bit about the data of immigration in Australia. As you can see, we have temporary, we have permanent, and we have citizenship. There's a flow from one to the other. And NOM stands for Net Overseas Migrants Migration. So we have people arriving either directly to temporary or directly to permanent. We have people departing, and some people move on to citizenship, of course. And I won't go into all of this, but we thought that, and it's in our Act as well, it's also in the terms of reference of the inquiry, that the objective function was to maximise or improve the well-being of the Australian people. And that objective function gives you quite a different outcome than if you tried to maximise the well-being of the world's population. I would say that if you tried to do the latter, you would have open borders. But we don't. We're trying to improve the former, so that's why there's an argument for having a quota. Australia has a very high percentage of migrants, of people born overseas compared to many other countries, most other countries. Approximately 50%, 48 to be precise, of Australia's population is either born overseas or has a parent born overseas, higher than just about every other country, as you can see, except Luxembourg and Switzerland. That's pretty high, isn't it? As you can see, there are a whole lot of categories in temporary and permanent. Given the time, and I want to allow time for questions, I won't go into each of these in general, but we have a system that has progressively become more skills-based, and that's an important feature. It's also the case that immigration is now the major driver of population growth in Australia since about 2005, as you can see there. So the green bars are the natural increase, that is births less deaths, and then the maroon or purple bars are net overseas migration. And this shows you projecting forward about the population impact of various forms of net overseas migration. If we were to if we were to cut migration off right now, as some people argued in our inquiry, we've had two sides. We had people say we should have open borders, and we had people saying that we should have none. Our population in 2063 would reach 26 million. If by contrast you have 300,000, it reaches 46 million, so it's 20 million extra, obviously. Crux of it is the percentage of population that are 65 or over. Obviously, net overseas migration provides a reduction in the ageing of the population, but as we made quite clear in our report, it is not a magic bullet. It doesn't solve the problem of ageing, it only delays it. The only way that you can prevent the ageing population in a perpetual sense is to increase the birth rate or reduce the mortality rate. Some people are trying both, I guess. This graph here shows the age structure of the current age of the population on the right. You can see from the vertical axis is age from 0 to 90, and it's quite spread up into in both males and females on the right, males on the left, and you can see it's pretty balanced in terms of age range there. Our net overseas migration, as you can see, is highly skewed towards the younger age range. Now, there's a term that the Germans use, which is about guest workers, are people who come and work in a society and never have hope of become permanent residents or citizens. And that is something I wouldn't say is a very good outcome, because what would happen there is you'd get a perpetually ageing Australian population, and you'd have a very young guest worker program, people arriving and departing after a few years, and there'd be a continued bifurcation between those two ages. And nor am I talking about, if anyone's ever watched Logan's Run, about having a maximum age in the society to keep a young population. Now, if we look at the permanent and temporary components, as you can see, temporary, which is the top bar there on each of those years, is the larger component, and it's much more volatile. It's uncapped in general, and it's driven by the market. Things such as student visas, 457 visas, working holiday makers and so forth, they go up and down with the economic cycle to some extent. The green bars, which is the permanent intake, they're much less volatile, and they are set by a quota. So the important feature of that, which is why the pricing system that Liberal Democrats proposed really can only be applied to the permanent intake, because it's quoted and you sell a quota. You can either auction a quota, which will then set the price as the endogenous variable, or you could set the price and then the quota would be endogenous. Permanent migration. There's a number of categories here: family, skill, special eligibility, and the humanitarian, which I think Jayde would want to talk about. Now, as you can see, the skilled part of our intake has grown quite remarkably over many years, and is now the largest single component. And it's also interesting to note about skilled primary versus skilled secondary versus family. What that means is that if I'm a person overseas, I'm applying for a migration status here as a permanent migrant, I have to fill a form in, and I'm the primary applicant. I have to demonstrate skills, in English language skills, other skills. The secondary applicant is the person who I've nominated on my form, children and partners. And family is when I've arrived in Australia, I now want to sponsor someone to come to Australia. They're family immigrants. The crux of that is that skilled secondary, they're classified as skilled immigrants, but they're not assessed for being skilled. Only the skilled primary applicant is actually assessed for being skilled or otherwise. And we can talk a bit about temporary. Obviously, you can see the large categories there of students, temporary work, which is 457, and working holiday makers, the major three components of that. And then we have the humanitarian intake. Australia has, with the recent increase in the number of Syrian refugees being announced in the last year, and it doesn't show up in this data, has the highest per capita intake in the world. And this is between as you can see, a lot have now been the red line is on the right-hand side, it's the percent of the intake, and the numbers on the left-hand side, they're all the bars. All of this is in our report. What I want you to notice here, because we've said that the system is basically skewed towards skilled immigrants, and there's good reason for that. If you look at the left-hand bars, there's about the participation rate, the number of people who actually go and get a job, who want to be in the labour force. Skilled primary applicants have more than the Australian-born, which is the right-hand purple bar. As you can see, it's about 90%. If you split it between male and female, you'll get some differences, of course, by culture. Immigrants from different cultures tend to have different nature and a different affinity for participation in the labour market. Unemployment rate is also lower for skilled primary applicants than the Australian-born. And the median income on the right, the bar is higher, which means, of course, they pay more tax. And the thing about that right-hand bar, right-hand line on the median income, skill actually includes primary and secondary. So primary and secondary are split out on both labour force participation and unemployment, but they're combined in the median income. And if you were to just have a line on the right-hand side for skilled primary applicants, you'd find it to be about $25,000 more for every age range, approximately, than the average. And this shows you the split over the various age ranges, and taxable income, of course, peaks in around about 49.50, and people's use of services, as we discussed in the last session, goes up in the older age ranges. So having immigrants who are younger, you miss out on some of the expenditure on the lower age range, the education side, and you get some high taxable income. So as you can see, it's fiscally that can be quite beneficial. Given the time frame, I don't want to talk too much, but you can see some of the tax paid estimates that we've put in our report. And I think I might save to the question time about pricing the benefits and arguments against it. I think the principal argument that I note today is that no other country rations its quota by price. And if Australia was to do so, you would encourage people who are highly skilled, the ones that, as you can see, tend to pay more tax and use less services, to migrate elsewhere. And that, I think, would be a crucial part of that argument. And finally, I'd like to conclude on two particular visas, about the significant investor visa and a premium investor visa. In our draft report, we said that we shouldn't have them. These are people who buy assets in Australia and get a permanent visa, and I find it a little bit quaint. I mean, just because people are not buying assets to lose money, why are you giving a valuable asset, as in a permanent visa, to someone who just buys Australian assets? Australia has no shortage of capital flows. So with that, I think I'll hand over to Jayde. And
questions before?
No, they can come all afterwards, if you like.
So my name is Jayde Lovell. I am the host of PsyQ on the Young Turks Network. So I'm a scientist by trade. I'm a neuroscientist. Any scientists in the house? Yes. The future is bright, my friend. So I am a scientist, and I'm also the only libertarian at the Young Turks Network, who are a progressive news network, the world's largest online news network. And they're huge Bernie Sanders fans, so often I'm the only one in the room arguing against things like free college education for everyone and free public health care for everyone. So it's nice to be in a room full of people that get it. Thank you, guys. So I titled this Refugees, You're Doing It Wrong. In the booklet, Tim introduced me as I used to be a libertarian, and then I went a bit soft, so I thought I'd pick a nice soft topic to talk about, but take a hardcore stance. I wanted to call it Australia, You're Doing It Wrong, but I was talking to my Uber driver on the way over, and he had a really good title for this talk. He said, on refugees, he said, I don't care, but it's not a bottomless pit, which I think is everyone in Australia's general point of view when it comes to refugees. And it's a libertarian conundrum. How do we increase liberty and the movement, the free movement of citizens and people around the world, whilst also living in the practicalities of a welfare state? So I know the older people in the room will remember this. This was the Tampa crisis of 2001, and it led to the John Howard policy and the slogan of, we will decide who comes into this country and the manner in which they come. Everyone in Australia was pretty adamant that we shouldn't let these refugees in. There were hundreds of mostly Afghani refugees. Their boat sank in Indonesian waters, and they were rescued by a Norwegian vessel, the Tampa, and were barred from coming in when the refugees demanded to be taken to Australia, and when the Tampa attempted to get into Australian waters, the Australian government said, you're not allowed to come. And I asked my mum at the time, why? Why don't we let these people in? And there was three main reasons. They're queue jumpers. So they're not coming the right way. They're not filling out the right forms and waiting their turn, which makes it harder for everyone else who is trying to do it the right way. They're economic migrants. So if they have enough money to get to Indonesia and pay someone to bring them over, then they're just coming to Australia to abuse our welfare system or make money. And the third is that they will disturb the peace. So we are Australians, we understand the Australian way of life, and these people are foreigners, they don't understand the way we live, and they are a risk to our way of life. And maybe they're terrorists. And then when later in life, when I graduated, I moved to New York City to be the host of a science YouTube channel. And I went to New York because I couldn't have that job in Australia. It only is going to be economically viable if I was outside of Australia. And I realised, hey, I'm an economic migrant. And as you know, if you want to live overseas, you have to get a visa. And as you know, the visa process can be really arduous. And so I paid money to the American government to move my visa application to express processing. And I realized, hey, I'm a queue jumper. And then I went to New York City, I started my channel, and as a part of my job, I'm a huge critic of the Obama government. Hey, I'm disturbing the peace. I'm a Tampa refugee. And when I saw that how much I have in common with refugees, I thought maybe we should be reconsidering how we see them. Refugees are a conundrum for libertarians because we like the free movement of people, and we don't like the idea of an authoritarian government restricting our movement. But strictly speaking, libertarians should not support government restrictions of any kind. But we do live in a welfare state, so when people come to Australia, they are entitled to all these benefits. So how can we have a libertarian approach to refugees whilst also not expanding the role of the welfare state? It's a tricky conundrum, but refugees are an obvious friend of the libertarian. These people are our natural allies for 3 reasons. One, they're generally coming here to escape government. So they are already fleeing either an authoritarian government or a government that's restricting them in some way. So they already understand libertarian principles and are, generally speaking, coming for more freedom. They're pro-freedom. They're often the least free when they get here. So refugees are a subject of the state, and as such, they often have very strict rules about what they can and can't do and who they can and can't make money for. And so they don't have the empowerment of libertarianism or freedom that we enjoy as citizens. And they're the cheapest new citizens. So what do I mean by this? We obviously understand the role of expanding the nation to make more money, but it's very expensive, and we often see refugees as this burden. We talk about the economic burden of refugees, but we need new citizens, and generally speaking, we do it by having children. But it's very expensive to have a child. It costs the government around $234,000 to raise a child from 0 to 18. So with their this is just their education and healthcare. An asylum seeker, someone that comes illegally and is kept in offshore detention, is also very expensive, around just over $200,000 for 2 years of detention and 4 years of integration into Australian society, but still cheaper than an Australian child. And then the Syrian refugees that we're about to accept, they are usually people of working age, and they're not going to be coming through detention. So they're only going to be about 4 years until we can flip them into taxpayers rather than welfare dependent. And they only cost the government $70,000. That's the government's figures, not mine. So we shouldn't really be talking about the economic burden of refugees. We should be talking about the benefits of refugees. Remember this whenever you think about refugee policy, think a free market requires the free movement of both capital and labour across borders. So whenever we're making refugee policy, we should be thinking, how can we encourage free movement of people as much as possible within the restrictions that we have? So I wanted to give you guys just 3 different case studies of libertarian policies towards migration and refugees that would be better than the current system that we have now. One is the United States of 1915, before 1915. They had basically an open border policy. So 98% of people that showed up in America were allowed in. The only 2% that were rejected had obvious problems that would have meant that they were probably going to be dependent on the government in some way. So either obviously infected with a communicable disease or obviously mentally ill, something like that. So 98% of people let in. And that led to a huge economic boom for the United States. Now, some people came and stayed. Some people came, worked, and left. But overall, it was a huge boost to the economy to have people that wanted to work, wanted to make money, coming into the country. If we can't have open borders, we can look at the Canadian example. Now, Canada has this incredible system called the Private Sponsorship of Refugees program. And it's been running since the late 70s, and it's an interesting case study where private citizens can sponsor a refugee. So they have to raise the money, either a church or a group of people. They raise the money and then they are responsible for that refugee. So it's similar to a tariff system, but they have the responsibility of making sure that they are financially secure, they have everything they need materially, but also providing economic support. And Canadian statistics show that people who come in as refugees under this system integrate faster into Canadian society. Because when they come, they're already surrounded by a group of people who are invested emotionally and economically in their success. And so right now, if I wanted to sponsor a Syrian refugee, if I said to the government, I'm happy to pay all of their expenses, I just want to do something to help the crisis, you know, I've got a spare room at my house, I'll pay for everything that they need, I can't do that. But in Canada, you can. So that's one way of getting more people in, but allowing private citizens to take responsibility for the global population. And the third example, despite what the Productivity Commission is going to tell you in their report, is selling citizenship or tariffs for migration. And there's a lot of countries that actually have citizenship for sale. So the Dominica, an island nation that's off the coast of the United States, is one example where you can buy citizenship of this country for $100,000. Pretty cheap. $100,000 you can be a citizen of the Commonwealth because they're a British territory. And you also have access to the European Union. So obviously this is a good investment for many people. And we worked out the Productivity Commission's published statistics on roughly what it would cost for an illegal migrant to get to the United States, to get to Australia, is around $30,000. That's how much it costs to come illegally, getting yourself to Indonesia and like getting on a boat. About $30,000. So we could disrupt the illegal migration of people by just saying, give us your $30,000 and you can come as a refugee. I mean, you'd obviously have to pass the same rules as refugees, but you've got the money to get here illegally, just give it straight to us. So by having a tariff on migration, we can accept more people into the country without having this burden, because the only people that would go this way are people that obviously have the capacity to work. So it's 3 ways that we can have a more libertarian approach to refugee policy than we currently do. We want to be good citizens. We all understand that we want to do something to help people in times of crisis. Refugees are obviously escaping, real refugees are escaping a huge amount of hardship, and we want to help. But we also understand that we live in a state where we can't have unlimited capacity to help people. So by taking a libertarian approach, we can do more to help the global community, but also do more to help the Australian economy. I'll leave you with this quote, and then Jason's going to talk more, I'm sure, on tariffs. There's one thing to have free immigration to jobs. It's another thing to have free immigration to welfare, and you can't have both. So it's not refugees that we should be afraid of, it's the welfare state we should be afraid of. Over to you, Jason.
All right, so I'm more or less going to say exactly what Jayde just said, but I'm going to say it with different words. Immigration is a complex issue that reasonable people can disagree on. And just, where is the room on this? So at one extreme we just want a huge wall around. In the middle we've got it's a complex issue. And at the other extreme we've got open borders. So wall. No, wall, a catapult on the inside. Complex? Open it up. This is interesting. I read that as about a third split. Well, no. The 2 extremes say it's not complex. There is a simple solution to this. It's the extreme case. So look, I'm going to more or less argue the extreme case, the open borders case. And I want to explain why. And to present this case understanding that reasonable people can disagree with every single part of this argument and do and have. For me, what this comes down to is there's a useful analogy here. And we've been here before. And as Jayde pointed out, once upon a time, 19th century, trade in goods and services, trade in capital, and flow of labor was basically free the world over, subject to the cost of doing so, and a few other various discrimination mechanisms that weren't strongly official discrimination mechanisms. But we've had that world before, right? America grew up in that world. And then the First World War happened and everything changed. And the entire 20th century was basically a story about fixing the global trade in goods and services problem and the global trade in capital problem. And the biggest public policy success globally was free trade, right? That has just led to an explosion of wealth and prosperity and erosion of misery. And if you'd surveyed any room at the start of the 20th century, the ones who said open borders would have been a very small minority to that story. But that was the right answer then. We can look back and say, yeah, it was complex, it was hard, there were losers, but on the whole, net, that was the winning proposition. And what my argument here, along with, this is Gary Becker's argument, this is Brian Kaplan's argument, economists far smarter than me have made this argument, that what the 20th century was to goods and services and capital, the 21st century is to labour. And we're going to have to spend the entire century fighting this argument towards this proposition that not it is universally for everyone the best, that would be absurd, but net, for a society, that's the position we want to get to. And for me, this isn't a fairness or a justice issue. This is just basically a human rights issue, where the fundamental human right is the right to trade. For me, to make a free contract with you for employment, to rent you my house, for me to rent your house, where I don't discriminate based upon where you were born. This is a right to trade issue, a fundamental human right, and the closed borders, put a wall up story is basically a prohibition on trade based upon where you were born. That's the argument. And the argument against it is just to show that the costs of that are significantly higher than the benefits that we believe we're getting from that position. So that's the argument. It's not a complex argument. It's the same argument we make about trade in goods and services, free flow of capital. It's not, and to repeat, it's not that everyone wins, always. It's that on the whole, we're better off with this argument. There will be winners, there will be losers. It's complex, but the principle is simple. All right, so that's sort of where I want to go. Another one I just want to hit off is we see this argument made about, well, it's okay if it's the right sort of immigrants, if they're skilled, if they're, et cetera, et cetera. That makes just as much sense as, well, we're going to let vehicles into the country, but they have to all be Mercedes and Porsches because, they're the good cars. We don't want just any sort of car coming into Australia or any sort of... It's exactly as absurd for the same fundamental economic reason, which is comparative advantage, gains from trade. We're just as well off with low-skilled immigrants as we are with high-skilled immigrants because gains from trade. It's not... now, for political reasons, for social reasons, for cultural reasons, we can have that discussion. But for economic reasons, that's an absurd proposition that we only want the highly skilled immigrants in and not the other ones. That's Econ 101. All right. So what I want to do with this is just so that's the economic argument in favour of open borders. Now, obviously, that we live in a more complex world than that. What can we do about this? So, in my mind, there's two basic pathways from where we are now towards that type of world, understanding this is probably going to be a process that will play out over the 21st century. This is not a next election will solve this. In the same way that the global movement of goods and services really did take a global effort by an enormous number of people, many, many decades to achieve, fighting against every single margin on the way. Two options. Both of them feel hard. First one is dual citizenship, or we have different levels of citizenship. And so this is the way to deal with the welfare problem, or we don't want to give up that, or we don't want them to have these privileges. Well, fine, don't give them those privileges. But that's not a reason to exclude trade with them. That's not say you can come but you can't vote, or you can come but you can't have the welfare, but I'm still allowed to trade with you. I can offer you a job, you can rent my house, you can't stop that particular aspect of it. So, again, reasonable people will have different margins upon what they're willing to accept on that, but that is one pathway into this, is just to basically have different types of citizenship. That's not my number one choice. My number one choice is to do exactly the same thing that we did with the previous one, which was, at the moment, we've got quotas, right? Just as we had quotas on trade, goods and services, and we had quotas on capital. Economic Theory 101 says quotas are bad, tariffs are less bad, right? You just take a quota system and you turn it into into a price-based mechanism. The reason that tariffs, and you can design a tariff that has exactly the same flow effects as a quota, that causes that the tariff is at a point that the same number of people will come in. So you can create an immigration equivalent tariff. But the benefit of tariffs, the benefit of a price mechanism, is that it's efficient at the margin. You get efficient sorting of people exactly who values the citizenship will trade off against the cost of doing so. It's just, again, this is an economics 101 argument. An equivalent tariff is more economically efficient than an equivalent quota. So you convert the system to a tariff system. That's this idea of a price mechanism. But that's not the end point. There's all sorts of advantages to that. The revenue goes to government, which flows back out. Well, let me finish that thought. The revenue passes through government. So my back-of-the-envelope calculation would put a number of about $60,000. That's more or less take whatever public goods measures you can of your infrastructure and roads, whatever, divide by population equals 60,000. You're buying your share of the club, right? Imagine that just passed straight through. So the club membership fees went back to the existing club members. That comes out at about $300 to $400 a year. So in terms of just dealing with political opposition, if it didn't go into general revenue and just literally passed straight through back out as a check that you'd receive, you'd receive a check of about $300 or $400 every year. And in terms of overcoming initial political opposition, there is that, right? So, but that's the logic of it. We're now thinking of just Australia as a club. You pay membership to a club that benefits those in it. The other thing about that is that sort of line of reasoning, that just sort of really functional line of reasoning starts to depoliticize this debate. It's not they're taking our stuff. It's, well, no, they've paid for the stuff now. So I think just the quota argument, the tariff argument has a potential to depoliticize this debate. Now, the other thing that it does with this is it doesn't force you to put people into boxes and say, well, that's a skilled economic immigrant, that's a family thing, that's a refugee. They're just people coming in, right? You don't discriminate for the reason. They don't even have to tell you the reason they want in, they just want in. That's, again, the logic of the story. All right, so to finish with this, the main argument against this, whenever this argument gets presented, is, well, that's fine if you've got $60,000. But what about the people that don't have $60,000? And there's a simple solution to this. One is, well, maybe someone else could pay it for you, charities, family, or HECS. This is what we do with education, right? You've got a similar situation. Citizenship has economic value in the same way that education has economic value. You could work through the tax system to essentially loan people that money, that start off their tax life with a negative $60,000 measure, pay that back. It's no weirder than HECS, whatever you think of HECS. All right, so finally, what else would have to change for this particular world to be true? Minimum wages have to go, or just anything that stops someone selling their skill. I mean, the whole comparative advantage argument hinges upon you being able to undercut in terms of wages. So that's a further, this comes as a package, this argument. You have to allow labour markets to function. The other one you have to do is occupational licensing has to be absolutely killed in its tracks for the same reason. If you're defining legally what a particular job is, you're harming the very people that are coming in to work with that. So occupational licensing regulation and labour market regulation would have to come into the reform package, and the welfare one as well. But again, that one, it's a complex story. We can deal with that in terms of different levels of citizenship. But that's the argument. To recap, you can make a fairness argument, you can make a bleeding heart argument. There's all sorts of ways you can cut this, but the strongest case is just a pure economic efficiency economic justice arguments, just says, government should not stand in the way of me contracting with other people voluntarily to do things that benefit us both. And at the moment, a closed borders story is doing that, and that's the argument against it. Thank you.
So I want to thank Tim, is he here? No, and the organizers of the conference for having invited me and invited me to be with such a distinguished group of co-panelists. I seem to have done something wrong in my life because I work at a university and I'm one of about 4 people who's right of center at an Australian university. We can't travel on the same plane together. And my life is to go to conferences. My area is constitutional law and human rights. And I go and I have to hang out with these people who've never heard a right of center argument. And I remember when I first came in 2005 and I was at a UQ meeting and I'm with all these high rollers and I said, I really like John Howard, and the entire room went quiet. I am not making that up. And so normally I go off to these human rights conferences, like going to a Salvation Army revivalist meeting. These people just say, I can intuit God's will. There's a right to housing. There's a right to health care. Jason just intuits this right. This is he is the arbiter of human rights. The problem is that some libertarians are just giving you the mirror image of what people on the left, they just have consulted with God, and they have got their finger on the pulse of changing social values, and human rights are just whatever they want them to be. And so my job today is to bring a little sanity to the debate, I think. Look, I am not a closed borders guy. I like the sort of Paul thing where you're picking people because they have something to offer. But you have to remember that this issue links in with democracy. You cannot have a democracy with open borders. That is why the supranational elite in the EU want no borders, because you can't vote then. And that means some elite group of people who read Ayn Rand are going to tell you what to do. It's not an attractive picture. So if you want to have voting, you actually need national sovereignty. You need to enforce your borders. And again, I'm telling you this as someone who is I'm small government. I'm really big on free speech. I'm big on almost free trade is one of the best things going. But you can't just stop the evidence. I mean, Jayde said, she was a queue jumper. Look, Jayde, you aren't a queue jumper. When you go to Disney, you can pay 2 prices. You can pay the slow price or the fast price. When you come here, you can pay the regular price or you can pay the VIP price. A queue jumper is someone who doesn't pay anything and goes to the dinner tonight. That would be you. So, here's the thing about the most common strand of libertarianism, because one of the weird things is, I'm a fellow traveler. I like all the outcomes. But some libertarians are basically natural law believers, right? They talk the language of natural law, about these self-evident moral truths that they can intuit. The rest of us who disagree, well, there's something wrong with our moral intuitions. Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence in the U.S., these self-evident moral truths. Or some people say just by being human, you have this list of entitlements. On the left, it's housing, it's health, it's a whole bunch of stuff. On the right, it's property, or you can come into our country. Rights do not precede government. That's just religious hocus pocus. Where rights come from is you come together, you live together as a group in civil society, and you opt for things that are going to have the best long-term consequences for people. So unless you're wanting some sort of disguised religion, like you get on the right, it's bonkers to think about this in any other terms. There aren't self-evident moral truths. Moral truths come from people figuring out what's going to be best in the long term for human beings. Free speech. John Stuart Mill, he was a utilitarian consequentialist. The arguments for free speech all boil down to countries that have free speech have a lot more welfare. And it's the same as you go through all of them. Unless you just want to hold hands, have a Coke commercial, and we all then will have different intuitions. And so there's really big problems going down that road. So that's my sort of introduction. There's no pseudo-religious mystical right to anything. Rights are just rules. A right is an others must claim linked to a duty where I must. You can have rights that come from law, which is the ones that really matter because you can enforce them, or you can have claimed moral rights, and then you have to tell people where they come from. And it's not so easy. And economists get up and they just tell you that there are these human rights because, I don't know, they read Eleanor Roosevelt in 1948 and she jotted down a few things and called it the UN Declaration. Which brings me to immigration. Again, I'm sort of in Paul's camp here, but I'm going to, take the hard line camp because otherwise we're sort of just like the Greens. We've just got this moral intuition about stuff and, there you go. You can't argue with people. Everyone just has their own sort of self-evident moral truths and Bob's your uncle. Or Bob's your wife soon after the referendum. So I get all the economic arguments. We're not talking that. I get the economies of scale and the comparative advantage and all that's good. And it's good to have more wealth. But of course, that's not the only value in life. Having a few extra bucks in your pocket at the end of the year is a good thing. But it's not the only good thing in life. And there are costs and benefits of everything. You have to weigh up costs and benefits, and you have to look at incentives. That's what economists do. They look at incentives, right? The economists don't go, I've got a moral insight from God, and then tell you what it's going to be. So a little bit higher GDP is a good thing normally, but it's not the only good thing. So I'm now going to bring up the subject that lingers at all of these events and nobody wants to talk about it. As Mark Stein said, it's the political correct banquo that's floating around. Because the assumption is that all immigrants are the same. Culture doesn't matter. We're all going to be hardworking Vietnamese who get off the boat and work hard and don't go on welfare and don't have wives that work 7 steps behind them. That kind of assumption is just not true. So the questions are all immigrants equal? And the answer to that is an empirical question, right? You can't just look into yourself and decide based on your moral intuitions. Does culture matter? Again, empirical question. And so, let's look at some evidence. And as it happens, I don't know a hell of a lot about this, but you know who does? His name's Trevor Phillips, the first head of basically what is our Gillian Triggs operation that should have been shut down a long time ago, called the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. That's what they called it in the UK, right? He is the man who invented the term, he coined it, Islamophobia, a couple decades ago. Now, some of you will have read this already. So, this year on Channel 4, there was a program fronted by Trevor Phillips, who 2 decades ago were saying, Muslim immigration from the Middle East is exactly the same as pick your favorite hardworking group. He has completely recanted. It's like, he's had a Damascene conversion. Anybody under 30 will have no clue what that means, but he's had a Damascene conversion. And part of the reason is they actually did a study, and they went out in the UK, and this was done. All of the interviewers were also Muslim, and on the big ticket questions like, would you help terrorists, they gave them a blank envelope. 1 in 5 Muslims in Britain, and they've been there decades, lots of time to assimilate, integrate, join the team, whatever you want to call it, has never entered a non-Muslim house. 39% say a woman should always obey her husband. Okay, well, you don't want to be totally hardline about this. I've been married 30 years, and I'm starting to see the attraction of that. 31% support the right of a man to have more than one wife. 52% do not believe that homosexuality should be legal. As Mark Stein always says, if things go the wrong way, I'm a pretty conservative guy, Stein says. I can grow a beard, get a few more wives. I'm not sure how homosexuals and feminists are going to do. In the long term in parts of Europe, now you're starting to wonder about this. 23% support the introduction of Sharia law. These are people who have been in the UK for decades. This should be worrying to people. It's overcomable. I'm not offering suggestions here, but it's worrying. And you can't worry it away. And some of this is worth $4 a year out of your pocket for coffee. You might say, I pay $4 to deal with this problem. Here's another one. 1 in 3, and they interviewed thousands, 1 in 3 would not report anyone who was indulging in terrorist activities. So that's only 2 million who would and 1 million who wouldn't. These are problematic on any basis. And if you don't like that, and you think that's all rubbish, go online and watch the Monk debate. The Monk debate is a really wealthy family in Canada who set up a debate where they actually, unlike in Australia or the ABC, get both sides of the argument. And they had one on immigration. Mark Steyn on one side and the Canadian Supreme Court Justice Louise Arbour on the other. And I think there were two others on Steyn's. It's great. You get both sides of the view. Powerful arguments both ways. Basically, I'm just here giving you a sort of insipid Mark Steyn sort of line. There are things in life that might come before having small government. When you look at countries where if you are a political party and you accuse the other political party of being apostates and they are all killed, democracy doesn't work very well. It's a real problem. And when you look at countries where this sort of things happens, you might say, we can't really run a functioning democracy. This is another Steyn line. In the Middle East, more books have been translated. If you compare the number of books that have been translated out of the native language in Spain last year, it's more than the last 1,000 years in every country in the Middle East. So maybe culture does matter. And maybe we ought to be a little... Now, you can't talk about this. You cannot talk about it. But you can't just pretend that facts don't matter. So it's at least an open question. So I worry about that. And I worry about the sort of cutting-edge group of libertarians who think they're not PC, but they don't want to talk about it. They just want to emote. So that's the Trevor Phillips line. And again, he's had a total conversion. Let me just finish then. We'll take more questions on that. Let me just finish on democracy. I'm a big Democrat. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how many rules you write down, and you can be like Hayek and you set them down, but Hayek didn't understand constitutional law. The fact is that all rules have to be interpreted by living people. And you can write them down and they can be as clear as you want, but if you have the people who are presently on the US Supreme Court, or more so on the Australian High Court, they aren't going to follow them. They are going to adopt a living tree, living constitution, changing social values approach to interpretation. I can give you case after case here in Australia. The words haven't changed, the meaning has. They say it's hocus pocus. Doesn't work. At the end of the day, the only thing that's going to get us sort of more free speech is to turn the Liberal Party into a group of people who actually have, a spine, and the useless people in that party, in the caucus who don't believe in free speech, vote them out and put people, that is the only thing that will do it. You have to fight for it. You can't go off to a bunch of judges and ask them, to use an implied freedom that they made up in the first place to strike down 18C. It's a loser strategy in the long term. And the reason things are bad is because nobody goes out there and argues for it. When the left of center political party in Canada can go out and make the argument for big spending cuts, because in Canada they got rid of a much bigger deficit in debt, with a left-wing party because they went out and argued for it. But nobody does that here. It's not a problem with the voters. It's a problem with the completely inept politicians, present company excluded. So you have to, there are reasonable disagreements on this. And there are reasons for thinking, we have the most generous humanitarian immigration intake in the world. How much more generous do you want us to be? Really? I'm listening there as if I'm back at home listening to my in-laws who have this picture that Australia is running a sort of the most restrictive immigration policy in the world. We are not. We are so generous. Now, should there be limits? I think there should be limits, because for me, there are other things that matter other than economies of scale, having a few extra dollars in my pocket. Not much more, but some things more. And to make democracy work in voting, you need borders. You can't work it any other way. When they talk about Bob Brown-like idiocies of a UN, everyone in the world votes, that basically means you don't have voting. Doesn't happen. You need defined boundaries, people who live there, and they make the choices, and they govern themselves. Right. So that means you can't have open borders and democracy. You can have open borders and go and live in a EU sort of supranational state. Good luck to you there. It's like hell. I'm really hoping for Brexit. And I don't care if it costs the UK money. I would vote for Brexit even if I were poorer. Because I would I work in a university. When I worked in New Zealand, it was an old-fashioned university department where we would vote on things We would vote on things and we would make decisions, and when I was on the losing side, I'd go, I had a say. Now I work in Australian universities. Nobody decides anything. You got these $1.5 million a year VCs with their 7 DVCs on 800,000 a year, their 12 PVCs, and it's the most centralized organization on the planet. Makes East Germany look like a sort of decentralized utopia. And when they tell you what to do, you get really annoyed. I would rather have a vote and lose than sometimes be on the winning side. So my basic final take is, this is like any other issue. You got to be hard-nosed about it. You got to look at the facts. And it may well be that culture matters, and you might want to take that into account. And you want to be hard line in the sense that you don't actually owe the world a living. And you don't, people in other places, yes, we've won the lottery. There is no doubt about it. If you're living in the West, you've won the lottery, right? But you've also won the lottery if you're smart and you're articulate. Does that mean you give did Sinclair give all of his money to the schmo down the street? So you can be hard line about this thing. And I actually think hard line in the sense of picking people who are going to come here and not go on welfare and who are going to be hard lined. Last point. I can't tell you how many people on the left of politics, when you go to these constitutional law conferences, tell you that any statute passed by Parliament pretty much that's over 2 days old ought to be repealed. They don't like any statutes that have any sort of 10, 20 years old. But if you bring up the 1951 Refugees Convention, 65 years old or whatever it is, it's like it's been chiseled in stone by Moses, right? He's come down and he's chiseled the UN Refugees Convention. The convention was talking about Jews in World War II. It doesn't work today. Nobody wants to talk about it. It doesn't work. It needs to be redone. And just because it's a treaty that was, it totally doesn't apply, you can't even talk about changing it. Nobody wants to talk about it. They're happy to change a statute, which has much more insight that's gone into drafting the statute. I don't have a problem about repealing any statutes, but convention they like. So again, you have to be skeptical. So I guess what I'm asking is, be as skeptical about this issue as you are about everything else, and we're not part of a religion.
I think Jim had about 5 last points, and if he had 10 commandments, there'd be 15. Now, who would like to ask a question? Let's start over here.
Regarding the recommendation, which was to not institute a tariff system, I assume roughly the argument was that if you just charge a price, we won't get the best immigrants. And well, I'm going to assume that's true for the moment because I don't want to really debate that point. But that's roughly the argument, that if we just had a price, we won't be able to pick the best immigrants. We'll get ones that pay less tax, blah, 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 blah. Assume that's true. Why couldn't we, for example, have subsidies or penalties? So if you're not a best immigrant, you might pay $80,000, but if you're a good immigrant, you pay $20,000 to sort of price those differences, or alternatively, have a tax credit. And then, even if we didn't do those things, what evidence is there that us not getting the best immigrants, that cost is less than the benefit we get from all the fees?
Okay. Well, remember that this was a draft recommendation, not a final, so I'll say that. Exactly. Well, I'm not sure I can go back in time on that. The point is that you're right. You could have price discrimination and you'd get a different result than if you have a single price. We did say that in the report. As for the other, well, I think the classic case is the parent visas. The Australian government actually estimated the present value cost of each parent visa holder to the taxpayer is about $400,000 to $500,000. We have 2 categories of parent visa: non-contributory, which currently have a waiting list of about 30 years, up to 30 years, and contributory, that pay $50,000. Sounds a lot of money. In the budget, the $50,000 appears in 4-year forward estimates as revenue, but the $400,000 is in the out years. So I guess that's my answer to that.
Thank you. I just want to say that I think it's absolutely absurd to make the argument and compare importing a human being to importing an inanimate object. A Mercedes-Benz isn't going to strap a bomb to its chest and blow people up. It isn't going to abuse women. It isn't going to try to introduce Sharia law into this country. And I would think that the scientists would have the observational skills to look at countries such as Sweden and see that the people that they are importing aren't the freedom-loving libertarians that she has painted a picture of them to be. I don't want to make an argument that we shouldn't have a humanitarian aspect to immigration, even if it is funded by taxpayer money. But how can you justify, with so many people who want to come to Australia that suffered from natural disasters or things like that through no fault of their own, how can you justify giving up their space to people whose ideology has directly resulted to their predicament?
I'll have a Jayde deal with
I think a bit of a fallacy here is that we will be overrun by Muslims. I think this is the undertone, if we're really honest with it. The undertone that we're getting from questions like that is, I fear becoming a majority Muslim country. I fear having Sharia law implemented upon me, or I fear terrorism. But here's a statistic for you. Since 9/11, the United States has admitted 745,000 refugees, 745,000 from a range of countries under a range of circumstances. So heading toward, it's 750,000 people under refugee visas. How many of them have committed mass murders or domestic terrorism, convicted of domestic terrorism? Does anyone know? Zero. Zero domestic terrorism cases in the United States from refugees. So if you want to talk about the evidence that we're going to be somehow overrun by terrorists, you're actually more likely, you're better off looking at your domestic population. The majority of terrorism in the United States, and not about Australia, I don't have the statistics for Australia, but for the United States, the majority of terrorism is not Muslims, but it's extremists on the right wing. So you shouldn't... Now, you know, it's white people that walk into black churches and shoot people. So I'm not saying that the risk of, I'm saying that we should have a rational and science-based... You have to be rational about it and look at the statistics so that the odds of actually being overrun by Muslim terrorists are extremely... You have to have them in a proportionate response to what the statistics say.
And keep our replies brief, please. Yes.
I mean, Jayde's totally right that you got a better chance of getting hit by a car, right? Of course. And it's also true that after decades, only about a quarter of British Muslims want Sharia law. Just a quarter. But look, the point isn't about terrorists. The point's about culture. And she's totally wrong on demographics. Read Mark Stein on this. Over half of kids under 8 in Belgium are Muslim. Over half. That's 8. The demographics, when some women are having 4 or 5 kids and some are having 1, it doesn't take, you know, your germ theory, it doesn't take very long to overcome it, right? So you can't, of course you can point to the US with 330 million people, where they mostly take in people from Mexico and Latin America. Of course, the US is always your best example, because the Americans actually assimilate people. They believe in assimilation. And the best population of Muslims in the world is in the US. Of course, I agree with all of that. You know, they play in the sports teams and they're actually integrated and assimilated because they make them be. They make everyone be assimilated and integrated. If you think that's even remotely happening in Australia, if you think we are just the special interest victimology country du jour, you know, with an occasional break for politicians to say "Je suis Charlie," which they're not. So I don't accept their analogy, although I do agree that if your focus is terrorist, that's the wrong focus.
I'm not an open borders libertarian, based on the fact that I believe in private property and freedom of association, and because we're not in an anarcho-capitalist society, we have delegated the country to a democracy. And I think
yes, you could ask.
Yeah, I think that, you know, if people decide they don't want certain people in their country, that should be their right. I don't think that libertarians can say you just have to allow anyone to come in and you just have to take it. So I think that's a very sort of you're just enforcing what you want on what most people don't want.
So my question is just regards to sovereignty, how Jim spoke of it. And obviously the question of open versus closed borders comes down to that notion, where does sovereignty lie? Libertarians would, I guess, take the idea and notion that personal sovereignty extends just so far as ourselves, whereby people who believe in borders believe there's, some kind of property in space.
Okay, I think that's enough. We should get
Well, I'm just curious to hear, with the libertarian viewpoint, with regards to enforcement and cultures, how they can imagine, like the enforcement and how it would end up
Let me just talk about the voting.
How about we get Jason to answer this one, since it's a libertarian question? Yeah, he doesn't have to.
I just say voting, you have to number people, you have to enumerate them and let them vote. There's 20 million Australian, 23. There's at least 60 million economic people who've got a bad deal. If everybody can vote, well, they're just going to decide they can do whatever they want. You have to confine it to people who are already there.
So this was directed to Professor Allan. So your argument is that we have to weigh up other things than economic benefits, like cultures, whatever. And I would say that economists are pretty good at weighing up things because we recognize that subjective or value is subjective and we can't sort of add up and compare across people. So why is it then that your hostility and your fear towards other culture is more valuable than my ability to rent or employ a refugee?
It's not. You vote for who you want, I'll vote for who I want. I'm a little bit surprised for you to say that economists are good at doing anything after the presentation in the other room, and I don't know who you are imagining works at Treasury, but let's assume that economists are good at something. Jason probably is. All I'm saying is, we ought to be able to vote, and if more people want to limit them, then that's good. The argument you always get against you is, well, you're just some sort of nativist racist because I've got my pipeline to God views on these moral issues, and so it doesn't matter how many people out there are against me. I am a morally superior being, which my point is exactly what the Greens say on the other side.